Rain fell over Chicago in thin silver needles, and Mara Vance had learned to read the city by its weather, the way sailors read the sea. Rain meant slow nights at the Blue Fig, the kind where regulars nursed their drinks longer and tipped worse, where the neon sign out front buzzed like a dying insect and the espresso machine hissed its one complaint over and over into the empty room. She had worked the dinner shift at the Blue Fig for 3 years, ever since her mother's illness had swallowed whatever savings the two of them had built and left Mara alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the wrong side of the river. She was 26 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned back out of habit rather than style, and a face people described as pretty, in the way you'd describe a photograph you found in a drawer. Pleasant, a little sad, easy to forget. The old man had been coming in for 6 weeks. He always sat at table 9 in the corner by the window, where he could watch the street without being watched himself. He ordered the same thing every time, a black coffee, dry toast, and on Thursdays a small dish of lemon gelato that the Blue Fig didn't actually have on the menu, but that Mara had started buying from the Italian market 2 blocks over, just for him, paying for it herself out of her tip jar, because something about the way his face lit up when she set it down in front of him made the $4 feel like nothing at all. His name was Salvatore. He never gave a last name, and Mara never asked, the way you don't ask questions of the quiet regulars who seem to carry entire lives behind their eyes that they've decided not to discuss. He wore beautiful coats that had gone soft with age, the kind of tailoring that outlived fashion, and a gold ring on his right hand that he turned absently when he was thinking, over and over, like a worry stone. "You are kind to an old man," he told her once, in accented English that rolled warm and unhurried, like a language built for slower centuries. "Do you know how rare that is? Kindness that expects nothing back." "It's just gelato, Salvatore." She'd laughed it off, refilling his water glass. "It is never just gelato." He'd looked at her then, with an intensity that unsettled her, though not unpleasantly, the way a photograph might unsettle you if you realized, looking closer, that the person in it seemed to be looking directly at you across time. "You remind me of someone. A long time ago. Someone good, I hope." "Someone I failed," he said, and did not elaborate, and Mara had let the silence close back over the moment, because that was what you did with regulars. You let them keep their silences. He asked her questions over the weeks, small things at first, where she was from, whether she had family, what her mother's name was, and when Mara told him, Elena, something moved behind his eyes, like weather changing far out at sea, a storm forming that hadn't yet reached the shore. "Elena," he repeated, testing the shape of it in his mouth. "A beautiful name. Italian." "I think there's Italian somewhere back a few generations," Mara said. "My mum never really talked about her father's side. He died before I was born. I don't even know his name, honestly." Mum didn't like to talk about him. "No," Salvatore said quietly. "I imagine she wouldn't." She hadn't understood the strange gravity in his voice until much later. That night, she'd walked home in the rain without an umbrella because she'd left hers under table 9 2 shifts ago and never gotten around to retrieving it. And she'd thought about Salvatore's face when he'd said her mother's name, and she'd told herself it was nothing. Old men got sentimental. That was all it was. 3 weeks later, he stopped coming. Mara noticed on a Tuesday Then a Thursday, when there was no gelato to buy, because there was no one to buy it for, and she found herself standing at the Italian market with $4 in her hand and nowhere to spend it, feeling a loss she had no right to feel for a man she barely knew. She asked Frank, the owner of the Blue Fig, if he'd heard anything. The old Italian guy? Died, I heard. Massive stroke, they said. Some fancy funeral out east. His people came and settled his tab, left a big tip. Guy must have had money somewhere. Way that suit fit him. Frank shrugged, already moving on to the next thing, because that was how the world absorbed the deaths of quiet old men who tipped well and asked for gelato that wasn't on the menu. It simply closed over them like water over a dropped stone, and life went on rippling outward as if nothing had happened at all. Mara went home that night and cried for a man she hadn't really known and did not understand why, and told herself that grief sometimes attached itself to whatever was nearest and did not always require justification. She did not think of him again for 11 days. Then a black car parked outside the laundromat, and a man in an impossibly well-cut suit knocked on her apartment door, holding a leather folder stamped with a wax seal she did not recognize, and told her that she was the sole named beneficiary of the estate of one Salvatore Conti, and that the estate in question was valued, after preliminary appraisal, at approximately $412 million. Mara Vance stood in her doorway in her work apron, holding a coffee-stained order pad, and laughed, because it was clearly, obviously, a mistake, or a scam, or a very cruel joke, right up until the moment the man's expression did not change at all, and she understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, like an elevator cable snapping, that he was not joking, and that her life, whatever shape it had held until that moment, had just ended. The law office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on Michigan Avenue, and Mara felt like an intruder the moment she stepped off the elevator in her one good blazer, the same one she wore to funerals and the rare job interview. The receptionist looked at her twice, the way people looked at things that didn't belong in a room, before showing her into a conference room with a view of the lake that made her chest hurt with how casually beautiful it was, how unbothered by the fact that her entire life was currently folding in on itself like a house of cards in wind. There were people already in the room. That was the first surprise. She had expected to sit alone with some elderly lawyer and a stack of papers, not to walk into a room already thick with tension, populated by people who looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. A woman in her 50s with severe cheekbones and a black dress that cost more than Mara's rent sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 men who might have been bodyguards or might have been sons. It was hard to tell, the way they held themselves, coiled and watchful. Across from them sat an older man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, who did not look at Mara so much as through her, cataloguing her and dismissing her in the same glance. And at the far end of the table, apart from everyone, sat a man Mara would spend the rest of her life trying not to think about, and failing. He was younger than she expected, maybe early 30s, dressed in black, with the kind of stillness that made a room feel colder. His hair was dark, cut close at the sides, and his jaw had the sort of hard, deliberate architecture that looked carved rather than grown. He did not fidget. He did not check his phone. He simply watched her walk in with an expression she could not read, dark eyes moving over her face, her hands, her cheap blazer, with the clinical precision of a man assessing a threat, or a puzzle, or both. Miss Vance. The lawyer, a thin man named Adler with rimless glasses, gestured her to the one empty seat, which was, she realized, with a lurch of unease, directly across from the dark-eyed man. "Thank you for coming. I understand this must all feel rather sudden." "Sudden," Mara repeated. "That's one word for it." A short, humourless laugh came from the silver-haired man. "She doesn't even know what she's inherited," he said, to no one in particular, in an accent that turned the words into something almost musical, almost mocking. Salvatore always did have a gift for theatre. "Mr. Moretti," Adler said, a warning in his tone. "Let him talk," the woman in black said coolly. "I'd like to hear what he has to say, almost as much as I'd like to hear the will." Mara looked between them, feeling increasingly like a woman who had wandered onto a stage mid-performance without a script. "I'm sorry," she said. "Can someone please explain to me who all of you are and what exactly is going on? Because I was told I inherited money from a man named Salvatore who ate breakfast at my diner. I didn't know he had—" She gestured helplessly at the room. "All this." The dark-eyed man spoke for the first time. His voice was low, deliberate, each word placed like a stone set into a wall built to last centuries. "Salvatore Conti," he said, "was the head of one of the oldest and most powerful families in Italy. Not a businessman, not eccentric old money. A man who controlled ports, banks, politicians, and a great deal of blood across 3 continents for the better part of 50 years. The room went very quiet. "He was my grandfather," the man continued, and something flickered behind his eyes that might have been grief, if grief were allowed to exist in a face like his. "Which makes what he did in that will either the greatest act of sentiment I have ever witnessed, or the most dangerous mistake of his life. Possibly both." "I don't understand," Mara said, though understanding was arriving anyway, cold and unwelcome, like water rising through the floorboards. "Are you saying he was in the Mafia?" "I'm saying," the man said, "that my grandfather built an empire that a great many powerful, violent people have spent their lives trying to inherit, control, or destroy. And 3 days ago, in a will notarized in Sicily and countersigned in New York, he left the entirety of his controlling shares, the empire itself, to a waitress in Chicago he'd known for 6 weeks. His eyes did not leave hers. To you." Adler cleared his throat and opened the folder. "If I may," he said, "I'll read the relevant clause exactly as written. To Mara Elena Vance, daughter of Elena Conti, granddaughter of my own blood, though the world was never permitted to know it, I leave all that is mine, in the hope that what was stolen from her mother may finally be returned, and that she alone might hold what the rest of you have only ever fought over." The silence that followed had weight, texture, a taste like copper. Mara heard herself say, in a voice that sounded very far away, "There has to be a mistake. My grandfather is dead. He died before I was born. My mother never even—" "Your mother," the silver-haired man, Moretti, said softly, almost gently, in a way that was somehow worse than cruelty, "was Salvatore's daughter, born from an affair the family made disappear 40 years ago, sent to America with a new name so that she would never be found and used as leverage against him. He never stopped looking for her. It seems, in the end, he found her daughter instead." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Congratulations, Miss Vance. You have just become the most valuable and most hunted woman in the Western Hemisphere." The dark-eyed man rose from his chair, and though he did not raise his voice, the room seemed to bend toward him regardless, the way a compass needle bends toward north. "My name is Rocco Conti," he said. "I run what my grandfather built, in practice, if not apparently on paper. And as of this morning, protecting your life is now my responsibility, whether either of us wants it to be." His gaze held hers, dark and unreadable, and beneath the ice of it, something that looked almost like fury, directed at fate itself. "I'd suggest you don't go home tonight, Miss Vance. It's no longer safe." She didn't believe him. Not really. Not all the way. Belief required a kind of surrender Mara wasn't ready to make, standing in a glass tower, with her ordinary life still clinging to her like static. She believed it the way you believe a stranger's warning about weather, abstractly, without changing your plans. Then she went home anyway, because home was the only thing that still made sense, and found her apartment door already open, the frame splintered where the lock had been forced, her few possessions upended across the floor like something had been searched for and not found. She stood frozen in the doorway of her own home, with her heart trying to climb out through her throat, and that was when Rocco Conti's hand closed around her arm from behind and pulled her back into the hallway before she could take another step inside. "Don't," he said, low and controlled, though his eyes swept the apartment with a coiled, dangerous alertness that told her he was cataloguing every possible threat in the space of a single breath. "You don't walk into a room that's already been searched, ever. Do you understand me?" "How did you even—" Mara's voice cracked. "Did you follow me?" "I had you followed the moment you left the building," he said, without apology, without even the decency to look uncomfortable about the admission. "You didn't believe me. Most people don't, the first time. It usually takes seeing it themselves." His jaw tightened as he looked past her into the wreckage of her apartment. "This isn't a robbery. Robbers don't search under floorboards and inside vents. Someone was looking for documents, proof of inheritance, account access, anything that would let them move faster than the courts." "Who?" Her voice had gone thin, stripped of its usual steadiness. "Who would even—" "Family," Rocco said, and the word came out of him like something bitter he was used to swallowing. "Extended branches, old allies who think loyalty is owed to blood and not to paper. My grandfather had enemies who've been circling this inheritance for decades, waiting for him to die so they could pick the bones. He handed the entire carcass to a stranger instead. You can imagine how well that's being received." She sat down hard on the top step of the stairwell because her legs had simply stopped being reliable, and put her face in her hands, and for a moment allowed herself the indulgence of feeling exactly as overwhelmed as she was. "I don't want any of it," she said, muffled into her palms. "The money, whatever this is. I want my old life back. I want to go serve coffee tomorrow and complain about my feet hurting and not think about any of this ever again." There was a long pause. When Rocco spoke again, his voice had changed. Not gentler exactly, but quieter, more careful, like a man handling something he didn't want to break by accident. "That's not an option anymore," he said. Not because I'm choosing that for you, because the moment my grandfather signed that will, the world decided for both of us. You can refuse the money. You can sign it all away tomorrow if you want to. It won't matter. The people hunting you don't care about legal technicalities. They care that you're the only obstacle standing between them and $400 million. And dead women don't contest wills. Mara looked up at him. In the stairwell's ugly fluorescent light, his face looked carved from something colder than skin. And yet there was an intensity in the way he watched her that felt almost like being seen, fully, for the first time in years. Not as a waitress, not as a convenient nobody, but as something that mattered, dangerously and completely. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, offering her his hand to help her up, "you come with me, somewhere no one can reach you, and we figure out how to keep you alive long enough to decide what you actually want to do with a fortune you never asked for." She looked at his hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was warm and startlingly gentle, at odds with everything else about him, the coiled violence beneath the tailored suit, the ice in his eyes, the way 3 grown men in that conference room had gone quiet the instant he'd stood up. "Why do you even care?" she asked, as he led her down the stairwell, away from her ruined apartment, toward whatever came next. "You didn't know me an hour ago. For all you know, I am exactly the kind of problem that would be easier to just remove." Something in his expression tightened, briefly, like a door closing on a room he didn't want her to see into. "Because my grandfather spent 40 years searching for the daughter he lost," Rocco said, "and in the last 6 weeks of his life he found her granddaughter instead, and decided she deserved everything he built, more than any of us who spent our lives clawing for his approval. I don't know if that makes you family. I don't know what it makes you." His eyes found hers again, dark and unreadable. "But I know what happens if I fail to keep you breathing, and I have never once failed at something I decided mattered." He said it like a vow. She would remember later that it had sounded like one even then, before either of them understood what it would cost. They left the building through a service exit into an alley where a black SUV waited with its engine already running, and Mara Vance stepped into a car that would carry her out of the only life she had ever known, into a world of penthouses and blood debts, and a man whose obsession with keeping her alive would, in time, become something far more dangerous than any enemy circling in the dark. The building rose 60 stories above the Chicago skyline, all black glass and cold geometry, the kind of tower that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. The elevator required a key card and a retinal scan, and Mara stood in its mirrored walls beside Rocco in silence, watching numbers climb, feeling smaller with every floor. "This is yours?" she asked, when the doors finally opened onto a private foyer. "One of several properties," he said, as though that were a normal sentence for a normal man to say. "You'll stay here. It's the most secure location I have access to on short notice. Full security detail, no unregistered entrances, cameras on every approach for 6 blocks. The penthouse itself took her breath away, despite everything. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a glittering, silent painting. Dark wood and marble. A fireplace already lit, though it was summer, as if the room existed in its own separate climate. It looked less like a home than a fortress dressed as luxury, every beautiful surface hiding, she suspected, some more dangerous purpose. "There are guest rooms down that hall," Rocco said, gesturing. "Choose whichever you like. My staff will bring whatever you need. Clothes, toiletries, anything from your apartment worth salvaging, once it's been swept for anything left behind. You are not to leave this building without me or without someone I've personally cleared. Not the lobby, not the roof, nowhere. Are we clear?" "You say that like I'm your prisoner." Something flickered across his face. Not quite offence, but close to it. "You're not my prisoner," he said, low. "You're the reason I haven't slept properly in 3 days, and I'd like to keep it that way for a long time, if it's all the same to you." She didn't know what to do with that sentence, so she ignored it, the way she'd learned to ignore most things that threatened to unravel her composure. "I need to call Frank," she said instead, "my boss. He'll wonder why I haven't shown up for my shift." "You won't be going back to the Blue Fig," Rocco said. "Not as an employee, at least. It's too exposed. Every regular customer, every delivery driver, every face you don't recognize is now a potential threat, and you have no training in identifying which. I'll have someone call your employer with an appropriate explanation." "That's not your decision to make." The words came out sharper than she intended, but something in her rebelled against the ease with which he was already rearranging her existence, 60 stories above the only life she recognized. "I've worked there for 3 years. I have people there, a life there. You can't just—" "I can," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who had never once had his authority questioned, and had long since stopped expecting to be. "And I will, because the alternative is you dying in a diner parking lot over a coffee shift, and I am not willing to let that happen. You can be angry with me about it, you're entitled to that, but you will still be alive tomorrow, which counts for something." Mara turned away from him, toward the window, arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The city sprawled beneath her, indifferent, full of people living small, ordinary lives she suddenly envied with an intensity that surprised her. "I keep waiting to wake up," she said quietly. "This morning I was worried about making rent. Now I'm being told I inherited $400 million and that people want to kill me for it. And I'm standing in some stranger's penthouse being told I can't even go to work anymore." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and she hated herself for it. She heard him move closer, though he stopped a respectful distance away, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back without him touching her. "I know this is impossible," he said, quieter now. Some of the ice thawed from his voice. "I know I sound like a man giving orders instead of a man trying to help. It's the only language I know how to speak fluently. Control is the only thing that's ever kept the people I care about breathing." A pause, weighted with something he seemed reluctant to say. "I'm not good at this part. The comfort. My grandfather is. He would have known what to say to you right now. I only know how to keep threats away from a door. I don't know how to make any of this feel less like the end of the world." Mara turned to look at him then, surprised by the honesty in it, so at odds with the cold command from moments before. Up close, in the low firelight, she could see faint lines of exhaustion under his eyes, the kind that came from more than 3 sleepless nights, the kind that came from years of never quite being permitted to rest. "You could start," she said, "by not talking to me like I'm an asset to be secured." Something that was almost a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Understood," he said. "Mara." Her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Deliberate, careful, like he was testing whether he was allowed to use it. I'll do better. Outside, the city glittered on, oblivious, and somewhere in it, men were already making plans that would bring blood to marble floors before the week was through. Dinner that night was quiet, served by a housekeeper named Rosa, who moved through the penthouse like a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by anything that happened within its walls. Mara picked at food too fine for her to properly enjoy, still reeling, while Rocco sat across the table reading through documents on a tablet, occasionally glancing up at her as though checking that she hadn't disappeared. "Tell me about him," she said eventually. "Salvatore, your grandfather. I only knew him as an old man who liked gelato and asked too many questions about my mother." Rocco set the tablet down. For a moment he seemed to be deciding how much of the truth she could bear, or perhaps how much he was willing to give away, of a man he clearly still grieved. "He built everything," he said finally, "from nothing. His father was a fisherman in Palermo who died owing money to men who would have taken it out of his children's hides if Salvatore hadn't found a way to pay the debt himself by the time he was 14. By 30, he controlled half the docks in Sicily. By 50, shipping lanes across 3 continents, banks that laundered money for governments that would deny knowing his name if you asked them directly. He paused. He was also, in his own way, a romantic. He loved my grandmother obsessively until she died young, and something in him never fully recovered from that. I think that's why the affair happened, with your grandmother, Elena's mother. Loneliness makes fools, even of powerful men. And they sent my mother away, Mara said. Because she was proof of it? Because she was a liability, Rocco said, with the blunt honesty of a man raised inside a world with no patience for softened truths. An illegitimate child born to a mistress was a weapon in the wrong hands. Kidnapping bait, leverage, scandal. My grandmother's family, his wife's family, the Morettis, the ones you met today, insisted she disappear. Salvatore agreed to protect her and spent the rest of his life regretting it. He hired investigators for decades trying to find where she'd been sent. He found her too late. She'd already died by the time his people traced her to Chicago. His eyes met hers, dark and steady. He found you instead. And from what I understand, in the 6 weeks he had left, he loved you the way he should have been allowed to love her. Mara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She thought of the gelato, the questions about her mother's name, the way Salvatore's face had changed when he'd said, "Someone I failed." She understood now, with a grief that arrived late and enormous, exactly who he'd meant. "He knew," she whispered. "This whole time, he knew who I was, and he never told me." "I think he was afraid," Rocco said, "that if you knew, you'd see him only as the man who caused your mother's exile, rather than as the man who loved you for exactly what you were. A waitress with kind hands and no idea what she carried in her blood. I think he wanted, just once before he died, to be loved simply, without the weight of all this." He gestured vaguely at the penthouse, the empire, the war brewing beyond its walls. "I understand that impulse more than I'd like to admit." Something in the way he said it made her look at him more closely. "Do you? Get to be loved simply, I mean." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "No," he said finally. "Every relationship I've ever had has been a transaction, a negotiation, an alliance dressed up as affection. My mother died when I was young. My father groomed me from the age of 10 to inherit exactly the kind of life you were just handed by accident, and made very sure I understood that love was a liability, same as your existence apparently was to my grandmother's family. I learned the lesson well, too well, some would say. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded flickering across his face before the ice slid back into place. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. Careful, controlled, dangerous when I need to be. That sounds lonely, Mara said quietly. It is, he admitted, with a rawness that surprised them both. But it keeps people alive, including, God willing, you. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable so much as charged, thick with things neither of them was ready to say aloud. Mara found herself studying his face, the hard lines of it, softened briefly by candlelight and confession, and felt something shift inside her chest that she immediately distrusted, because falling for the dangerous man who now controlled every door in her life seemed like exactly the kind of mistake a woman in her position could not afford. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. "The family history, your father, none of it is information you need to give me." "Because you deserve to understand what you inherited," Rocco said. "Not just the money, the blood, the grief, the debts owed and unpaid across generations. My grandfather gave you all of it, whether he meant to or not. I think it's only fair you know exactly what kind of inheritance you're carrying." He paused, and something quieter entered his voice. "And because it's been a very long time since anyone asked me a question and actually wanted to hear the true answer instead of the useful one." Later that night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in a penthouse 60 stories above a city that no longer felt like home, Mara stared at the ceiling and thought not of the money or the danger or her ruined apartment, but of the way Rocco Conti's voice had cracked almost imperceptibly when he'd admitted that no one had ever asked him a true question before. She told herself it meant nothing. She did not believe herself even a little. By the end of the first week, Mara had learned the rhythms of her new prison that wasn't quite a prison. Breakfast at 7, brought by Rosa with a gentleness that made her homesick in a way she couldn't articulate. Security briefings at 9, in which men with earpieces and unreadable faces discussed threat assessments in clipped, professional tones that made her feel like an object being appraised rather than a person being protected. And evenings, increasingly, with Rocco. Quiet dinners that stretched longer than either of them seemed to intend, conversations that circled ever closer to something neither of them named. The Morettis made their move on a Tuesday. It began with a phone call Rocco took in the next room, his voice dropping into a register Mara hadn't heard before. Flat, lethal. The voice of a man discussing violence the way other men discussed weather. When he returned to the living room, his expression had gone carved from stone. "They've filed an emergency injunction," he said, contesting the will, claiming undue influence, incapacity, fraud, every legal maneuver they can throw at a judge to freeze the estate before it transfers to you. "Is that bad?" Mara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the tightness around his eyes. "It's a delay tactic," Rocco said. "It won't work, legally. My grandfather was examined by 3 independent physicians in the final weeks, specifically to preempt exactly this challenge. He was many things, but careless was never one of them, even dying. He began pacing, a controlled, coiled energy radiating off him that made the room feel smaller. But it buys them time. And Moretti doesn't need to win in court. He only needs enough chaos to make an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Rocco stopped pacing and looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop before he even said the words. To remove you, he said, and let the estate default to next of kin through the courts, which, absent your inheritance, reverts significant control to the Moretti branch through my grandmother's original marriage contract. It's an ugly, decades-old clause no one thought would ever matter again. It matters very much now. Mara sat down slowly. So they want me dead. Legally, that actually helps them. Yes, Rocco said, with the blunt honesty she was beginning to both dread and respect in him. Which is why the injunction isn't the actual danger, it's cover. While lawyers argue in a courtroom about your competency to inherit, Moretti's people will be looking for a way to make the argument permanently unnecessary. As if summoned by the thought, Rocco's phone buzzed again. He read the message, and his face went very still in a way that frightened her more than any shouting could have. What is it? A car followed Rosa's grocery delivery back from the market this morning, he said. Same car was parked outside the Blue Fig 2 days ago when my men did a routine check on your former workplace. Same plates, traced to a shell company with ties to Moretti's security detail. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. Not for himself, she understood with a jolt, but for her. They know where you are, or close enough to it. This building's security is good, but it is not infinite. And Moretti has patience I have learned to respect the hard way over many years. So what do we do? We move you, Rocco said. Tonight. Somewhere off any registry, any paper trail, anywhere Moretti's information doesn't reach. He was already moving, already issuing instructions into his phone in rapid Italian, arranging cars, routes, a destination he didn't share with her yet, the coiled, competent violence of him fully unsheathed now, and Mara understood, watching him, that she was seeing for the first time the man beneath the careful penthouse host, the man who had built and defended an empire with his bare hands and his considerable will. "Where are we going?" she asked, as Rosa appeared with a bag already packed, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this order for days. "My family has a property outside the city," Rocco said. "Isolated, defensible. No public records connect it to me directly. It was purchased through channels even my own father wouldn't have been able to trace easily. If Moretti's people are watching this building, they won't see us leave the way they expect." That sounds like it took a lot of planning for a place you weren't sure you'd need. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. "I plan for every outcome where you end up dead," he said. "It's the only way I know how to make sure none of them happen." He held out his hand to her, the same gesture from the stairwell days ago, and Mara found herself taking it without hesitation this time, some part of her already trusting the warmth of his grip more than she trusted the marble fortress around them. "Rocco," she said, as they moved toward the service elevator, Rosa and 2 guards falling into step around them like a moving wall of protection. "If they find us tonight, if it comes down to it, what happens?" He looked at her, and the answer in his eyes was more honest than any words could have been. "Then I make sure it's me they have to go through first," he said. "And I promise you, Mara, that has never once gone well for the men who tried." The elevator doors closed on the glittering penthouse, and somewhere across the city, in a house every bit as fortified as the one they were fleeing, Moretti's men checked their weapons and waited for word that the girl had been found. The drive took 90 minutes, through back roads Mara couldn't have found again if her life depended on it, which, she reflected grimly, it very well might some day soon. Rocco sat beside her in the back of an armoured SUV, one hand resting near the gun she now knew he always carried, the other, unexpectedly, resting near hers on the seat between them, close enough that she could feel its warmth without either of them acknowledging the fact aloud. The house, when they arrived, was nothing like the penthouse. A low, sprawling stone farmhouse set behind a tree line, more fortress than mansion, its windows reinforced, its grounds patrolled by men who melted in and out of the darkness like they were part of the landscape itself. "This was my grandfather's," Rocco said, as they walked through a door reinforced with steel disguised as old oak. "He built it as a retreat, somewhere he could disappear from all of it, occasionally. I used to spend summers here as a boy, before my father decided sentiment was a weakness he needed to train out of me." Inside, the house was warmer than its exterior suggested. Worn leather furniture, walls lined with old photographs Mara found herself drawn to almost against her will. She stopped in front of one, a much younger Salvatore, dark-haired and laughing, his arm around a woman Mara didn't recognize. "My grandmother," Rocco said, following her gaze, "before she died. He never took this photograph down, in any house he owned. Kept a copy in every one, like a compass point he needed to keep finding his way back to. He must have loved her very much." He did. And it made him vulnerable in ways he spent the rest of his life trying to armour against. Which is, I suspect, part of why he never told your mother the truth, and why he waited until he was dying to finally seek you out. Love, in this life, is always eventually used against you. He learned that lesson at terrible cost. Rocco's eyes moved to her face, and something unspoken passed between them. A warning, perhaps, or an admission. "I was taught the same lesson much younger." They ate dinner that night in the farmhouse kitchen, simpler than the penthouse's elegant dining room, and something about the modesty of it made the conversation flow easier, less guarded. "Tell me something true," Mara said, echoing his words from days before. "Not useful, true." Rocco considered her for a long moment, firelight catching the hard planes of his face, softening them just slightly. "I have not wanted to protect anyone the way I want to protect you," he said finally, "since I was young enough to still believe wanting things was safe. I've spent 10 years building walls, specifically designed to keep myself from feeling exactly what I am currently feeling, and none of them have held for more than a week around you." His jaw tightened, as if the admission cost him something physical. "It terrifies me considerably more than Moretti does." Mara's breath caught. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because everyone I have ever loved," Rocco said, quiet and raw, "has become a weapon someone else could point at me. My mother, my grandmother by proxy, in my grandfather's grief, now you. The moment my enemies understood that I intend to keep you breathing regardless of personal cost, you stopped being merely an inheritance dispute and became my single greatest vulnerability." His eyes held hers, dark and unguarded in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. I don't know how to want something and still keep it safe. I have never once managed to do both. Maybe, Mara said softly, reaching across the space between them to rest her hand over his. You don't have to do it alone. He looked down at her hand on his, and something in his expression cracked open. Not broke exactly, but shifted, like ice under sudden warmth, revealing dark water moving beneath. Mara, he said, her name rough in his throat. I need you to understand something. If I let myself have this, I will not be a gentle man about protecting it. I have killed men for far less than what Moretti intends for you. I will burn down everything I have built before I let anyone take you from this world. His hand turned beneath hers, fingers lacing through hers with a desperate carefulness, as though she were something he was terrified of breaking and terrified of losing in equal measure. I need you to know exactly what you'd be choosing if you choose this. Choose me. I already know what kind of man you are, Mara said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it without fear. I've watched you all week. You could have handed me off to security and never thought of me again. Instead, you've barely slept. You've moved your own operations base for my safety. You tell me true things when you could tell me useful ones instead. Her thumb traced slowly over his knuckles. I'm not afraid of what you are, Rocco. I'm afraid of how much I already don't want to leave. The fire cracked and settled in the hearth. Outside, guards patrolled a perimeter built to keep death at bay. And inside, two people who had spent their entire lives learning not to want anything too much, finally, carefully, dangerously, let themselves want each other instead. Rocco lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat. Then stay, he said, not because you have nowhere else to go, because some part of you, however small, wants to be here, with me. I do, Mara whispered. God help me, I do. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality, as though the farmhouse existed outside of time, a bubble of quiet between the violence that had brought them there and the violence Mara sensed with growing dread was still to come. Rocco taught her small things in the mornings before the security briefings began. How to read a room for exits, how to recognize the particular stillness of a man carrying a concealed weapon, how to move through a space like she belonged there rather than like prey trying not to be noticed. She resisted the lessons at first, some part of her rebelling against the idea that she needed to become a different woman entirely to survive her own inheritance. I don't want to become someone who thinks like this, she told him, after a particularly frustrating morning of failing to notice a guard he'd planted specifically to test her. Cold, calculating, like you. Something flickered across his face, hurt, quickly masked. I'm not asking you to become me, he said. I'm asking you to survive being you in a world that wants you dead. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. She softened, seeing the wound she'd accidentally opened. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. It was fair enough, Rocco said, quieter now. I know what I am, Mara. I've never pretended otherwise, not even to myself. I would simply prefer, selfishly, that you not become it too. There should be someone left in my life who still remembers how to be soft. His eyes, when they met hers, held something unbearably vulnerable. I find I would like that someone to be you. It was in the afternoons that Mara found herself most content. Reading in the farmhouse library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books in 3 languages, many of them, she suspected, unread by anyone in the family for decades. She found herself drawn, again and again, to Salvatore's old journals, written in a mixture of Italian and English, and began, slowly, painstakingly, to translate the parts that mentioned Eleanor, her mother, a ghost she was only now beginning to understand. I think of her every day, one entry read, in Salvatore's careful, old-fashioned hand. Eleanor would be 30 now, a woman grown, with a whole life I know nothing of. I have hired men to find her 100 times and called them off 100 times, because what right do I have to disturb whatever peace she has built without me? Better she never knows the cost of the life she was spared. Better she thinks her father simply died, rather than chose, however impossibly, to let her go. Mara closed the journal, tears she hadn't expected blurring her vision, and found Rocco watching her from the doorway, having entered so quietly she hadn't heard him. "You never stopped grieving her," she said, "even from a distance, even without knowing her." "No," Rocco agreed, crossing the room to sit beside her. "He didn't. I used to think it made him weak, that a man who controlled so much could be so thoroughly undone by a choice he made decades before I was born. I understand it better now." His hand found hers, an easy intimacy that had grown between them over the preceding days without either of them quite naming it. Loving someone you're forced to protect from a distance is its own particular hell. "Is that what this is?" Mara asked. "Us? A hell you're choosing?" "It's the only heaven I've ever been offered," Rocco said, and kissed her. It was not their first kiss. That had happened 2 nights before, tentative and searching, in the farmhouse kitchen after a bottle of wine had loosened something guarded in both of them. But it was the first that felt like a decision rather than an accident. Deliberate and slow and utterly consuming. His hand cradling her face like she was something precious he'd been forbidden from touching his entire life and had finally, recklessly, decided to claim anyway. When they broke apart, breathless, foreheads resting together, Rocco spoke against her lips, his voice rough. "I need you to understand," he said, "that whatever this becomes, I am not capable of loving you halfway. I don't know how to want something small. If you let me have this, Mara, I will be possessive and jealous, and I will not apologize for either, because I have already buried too many people I loved carefully to risk losing you through carelessness now." "I'm not asking you to love me carefully," Mara whispered back. "I don't think I'd believe you if you tried." Somewhere beyond the farmhouse's fortified walls, a car idled on a country road that shouldn't have had any reason for traffic, its driver photographing the property's perimeter with a long lens, transmitting the images to a man in Chicago who smiled coldly at what he saw and began making calls of his own. The fragile peace, Mara would come to understand, had already begun its countdown to ending, even as she let herself, for the first time in years, believe in something as dangerous as happiness. It happened on a Thursday. Mara would remember that detail for the rest of her life. The absurd cruelty of it being a Thursday. The day she used to buy Salvatore his gelato. The day that now marked instead the first time she watched a man try to kill her in earnest. She was in the farmhouse's kitchen garden, cutting herbs for Rosa's dinner preparations, under the watchful eye of a guard named Enzo, when the first shot came. Not aimed at her directly, she would learn later, but at Enzo, who went down with a wet, terrible sound that turned Mara's blood to ice water in her veins. What followed happened too fast for her to process in real time. Only in fragmented pieces she would replay for months afterward. Rocco's voice suddenly beside her, shouting her name, his body covering hers as he pulled her down behind the low stone garden wall. The deafening, rhythmic percussion of gunfire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Stay down," Rocco said, his voice a low, controlled snarl, utterly unlike anything she'd heard from him before, gun already in his hand, eyes scanning the tree line with a predator's focus. "Do not move from this spot. Do you understand me?" "Rocco." "Mara." Her name came out sharp, urgent, the only crack in his otherwise total control. "I need you to trust me completely, right now, more than you have ever trusted anyone. Stay here. I will come back for you, I promise you that. But I need you to stay down." She stayed, crouched behind cold stone, hands pressed over her ears, listening to a firefight that seemed to last both seconds and an eternity, praying to a god she wasn't sure she still believed in, that the next voice she heard would be his. It was. Rocco returned for her, covered in someone else's blood, his own uninjured, but his eyes wild in a way she'd never seen, and pulled her into the house through a side entrance she hadn't known existed, shouting orders to men she recognized as his security detail, coordinating a response with a coldness that frightened her almost as much as the gunfire had. "2 dead," he told her later, once the house had been secured, once the immediate threat had been neutralized and confirmed gone. His voice was flat, exhausted, stripped of its usual command. "Enzo and Marco at the East Gate, both good men. Both dead because Moretti decided a farmhouse full of guards was worth the risk of an open assault." "This is my fault," Mara said, the words tearing out of her before she could stop them, guilt already curdling into something physical in her stomach. "If I hadn't inherited any of this—" "Don't." Rocco's voice cut through her spiral with unexpected sharpness. "Don't you dare take responsibility for the choices of men who decided murder was an acceptable business strategy. Enzo and Marco knew the risks of this life the day they took the job. You did not choose this. My grandfather chose it for you, out of love, however complicated, and Moretti chose violence in response, out of greed. None of that blood is yours to carry." "Then whose is it?" "Mine," Rocco said, quiet and certain. "Every drop of it, from now until this is finished. I told you I would protect you, and 2 of my men died proving that promise was worth something. I will not let their deaths mean nothing by allowing you to bury yourself in guilt instead of living the life they died defending." Mara found herself crying then, finally, the accumulated terror and grief of the day breaking through the shock that had held her together through the actual violence. And Rocco pulled her against his chest without hesitation, holding her with a fierceness that felt like both comfort and vow. "I thought you were going to die out there," she said into his shirt, still faintly smelling of gunpowder and someone else's blood. "I have known you for 11 days, and I thought my heart was going to stop when I heard those shots." "I have buried people I loved for 30 years, Rocco said into her hair, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be fighting to keep controlled. "I have never once, in all that time, been as afraid as I was in the 3 seconds between hearing that first shot and getting my body between you and the tree line." 11 days, Mara. It took 11 days for you to become the single thing I am most afraid of losing in this entire world. He pulled back to look at her, cupping her face in hands still faintly trembling with adrenaline. "I don't know what that makes this. I only know I am not willing to survive discovering what it would do to me to lose it." That night, for the first time, Mara did not sleep in the guest room down the hall. She slept in Rocco's arms, in his bed, both of them fully clothed and utterly exhausted, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. And somewhere in the darkness before dawn, Mara understood with absolute clarity that whatever this was between them, it had already become far too dangerous, far too consuming, for either of them to walk away from unscarred. The morning after the attack brought with it a change in Rocco that Mara noticed immediately. A hardening, a narrowing of focus that reminded her he was, whatever else he might be to her privately, a man who ran an empire built on violence and had just watched 2 of his men die defending a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks. "I'm going to Chicago," he told her over breakfast, his voice flat and final. "Today. I need to speak with Moretti directly." "That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that gets you killed." "It's exactly the kind of thing that prevents further killing," Rocco corrected, "if handled correctly. An open assault on my property is a declaration Moretti wouldn't have made lightly. It means he's confident, or desperate, or both. I need to understand which, and I need him to understand that whatever confidence he's found, it will not survive contact with what I'm prepared to do to protect what's mine." "And if he decides to just kill you too, solve both his problems at once?" Something almost like a smile touched Rocco's mouth, cold and dangerous. "He's had 30 years to try that and never once come close to succeeding. I don't intend to make this the exception." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "I need you to stay here with the reinforced detail I'm bringing in. I need to know you're safe while I handle this." "I don't want you to go." "I know," Rocco said, quiet and unexpectedly gentle. "I don't want to go either. But there is no version of our future together that doesn't require me to finish this properly. And finishing it requires facing him directly, on my terms, rather than his." His thumb traced slow circles against her knuckles. "Trust me a little longer, Mara. I have never given you a reason not to yet." She let him go, though every instinct screamed against it, and spent the day in an agony of waiting that made the previous week's danger feel almost peaceful by comparison. At least then she'd known where he was. The meeting, when Rocco recounted it to her that evening, had taken place in neutral territory, a restaurant in the Italian district that had hosted such conversations apparently for 3 generations of both families, its owner sworn to a discretion older than either of them. "He denied ordering the attack," Rocco told her, pouring them both wine with hands that still, faintly, betrayed the tension of the day. Which I expected. Men like Moretti never claim their own violence directly. It's beneath the theatre of respectability he's spent his life constructing. But he didn't deny wanting you gone either. He was almost pleasant about it, which is, in my experience, always the most dangerous version of him. What did he say? Rocco's jaw tightened. That he found it curious, he said, that Salvatore's granddaughter had already found her way into my bed within 2 weeks of inheriting a fortune. He suggested, not subtly, that perhaps I intended to marry you and consolidate the inheritance under family control, regardless of what the will specified, and that if that was my plan, he'd prefer to negotiate a resolution before more of his men, or mine, ended up dead over a woman neither family truly needed alive. Mara went very still. He offered to have me killed for money. He offered, Rocco said with visible distaste, to buy your silence and disappearance, quietly, generously, if I would simply agree to sign the estate over to joint family control instead. He seemed to believe this was a reasonable business proposal rather than the moral obscenity it actually is. His hand tightened around his wineglass. I declined, somewhat forcefully. How forcefully? Forcefully enough that he understands now precisely how far I am willing to go to protect you, Rocco said, meeting her eyes. I told him that the next attempt on your life, successful or not, would be met with the complete and permanent dismantling of everything his family has built over 3 generations, and that I would consider it a personal pleasure rather than a professional obligation. His voice, when he continued, had gone soft in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence of his words. I told him I loved you, that I hadn't intended to, that it had happened regardless, and that a man in love does not negotiate the safety of what he loves, he simply removes anything that threatens it. Mara's breath caught. You told him you loved me, before you told me. Something like tenderness broke through the hardness in Rocco's expression. I suppose I did, he said. It seemed important in that moment that he understand exactly what he was risking a war over. I'm sorry you heard it second-hand. He rose from his chair, rounding the table to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his with a solemnity that made her heart stumble in her chest. Mara Vance. I have spent 30 years believing love was a weakness other men could exploit, and I have spent the last 2 weeks discovering that loving you feels instead like the only strength I have left that actually matters. I love you. I am not good at saying it, and I will likely be worse at proving it in ways that don't involve threatening violence on your behalf. But I needed you to hear it properly, from me, and not as a threat delivered to an enemy over dinner. Tears blurred Mara's vision, months of fear and loss and unexpected tenderness converging into a single overwhelming moment. I love you too, she whispered. God help me. I fell for the most dangerous man in Chicago in under 2 weeks, and I don't regret a single second of it. Rocco kissed her then, slow and searching, a vow disguised as tenderness, and for a brief, precious hour, the war circling them both seemed to recede into background noise, drowned out by something neither of them had expected to find amid all the blood and grief and inheritance of ghosts. It would not last. Somewhere across the city, Moretti sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of a woman who had died decades before, and made a decision that would soon shatter whatever fragile peace Rocco and Mara had built. 2 weeks passed in an uneasy détente, punctuated by security briefings and legal manoeuvring as Adler's firm fought Moretti's injunction through the courts. Rocco insisted, despite the ongoing threat, that Mara needed to be seen publicly at least once. A calculated appearance, he explained, that would demonstrate to the wider criminal world that she was neither hidden nor afraid, and that the Conti family stood behind her without reservation. "It's a nightclub my family has owned for 2 decades, he told her, as they dressed for the evening in the penthouse they'd cautiously returned to, security tripled since the farmhouse attack. Neutral territory, technically, though everyone in that room will know exactly whose it really is. It's where business happens, disguised as pleasure. Tonight, we make it clear that you belong to this family, and that touching you means declaring war on everything I control." Mara smoothed the unfamiliar silk of a dress Rosa had procured for her, deep red, cut to be both elegant and dangerous, nothing like anything she'd owned in her old life, and studied her reflection with something between fascination and grief for the woman she used to be. "I don't recognize myself," she admitted. Rocco came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror, his hands settling with quiet possessiveness on her hips. "I recognize you," he said. "Every version of you. The waitress who bought an old man gelato with her own tip money. The woman who translated her grandfather's grief out of old journals. The woman standing in front of me now, about to walk into a room full of dangerous men and hold her own against every one of them." He pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder. "You have not disappeared, Mara. You have simply been given a larger stage." The club, when they arrived, was everything Rocco had described, glittering, exclusive, populated by a clientele that moved with the particular watchfulness of people who understood exactly how dangerous the room's owner truly was. Heads turned as they entered, whispers rippling outward, and Mara felt Rocco's hand settle at the small of her back, warm and grounding. A silent claim made in front of an audience that understood its language perfectly. It was near midnight when trouble found them, in the shape of a woman Mara didn't recognize, but Rocco clearly did. Beautiful, dark-haired, dressed in black that matched the coldness in her eyes. "Rocco," the woman said, her voice carrying an intimacy that made something ugly twist in Mara's stomach. "It's been too long, and this must be the waitress everyone's talking about." Her gaze swept over Mara with an appraisal that felt like being priced at auction. "I can see the appeal, I suppose. Something about strays always did bring out your protective instincts." "Gia," Rocco said, his voice gone flat and cold in a way Mara hadn't heard directed at anyone but Moretti. "This is Mara. Mara, Gianna Moretti, Antonio's daughter." The name landed like a struck match. Mara felt her spine straighten. "Ah," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "The family currently trying to have me killed. Lovely to finally put a face to the conspiracy." Something that might have been respect flickered across Gia's expression before it smoothed back into cool amusement. "Direct? I can see why he likes you." Her eyes cut to Rocco. "You know this doesn't end well for her, whatever you've decided to feel. My father doesn't stop because you've fallen in love, Rocco. He stops when the problem is removed, one way or another." "Your father," Rocco said, voice low and lethal, "will stop the moment he understands that any further attempt on her life ends every remaining Moretti holding in North America within the week. I've been patient because patience serves me. Do not mistake it for limitation. Gia's smile was thin, sharp as broken glass. How romantic, threatening an entire family for one waitress. She turned her attention back to Mara, something almost like pity in her expression. For what it's worth, and I doubt it's worth much coming from me, I'd disappear if I were you. Take the money you can access quietly, go somewhere with a different name, and let the rest of them tear each other apart over what's left. Loving Rocco Conti has never once kept anyone alive longer. Ask his mother. Ask his grandmother. Ask, God rest him, his own grandfather, dead barely a month after finally finding the one person he'd spent his whole life searching for. The words hit their mark with surgical precision, and Mara saw Rocco's jaw clench, saw some old grief flare behind his eyes before he mastered it. "That's enough, Gia," he said, quiet and dangerous. "Is it?" Gia's gaze lingered on Mara a moment longer. "Good luck to you, waitress. You'll need considerably more than his protection to survive what's coming." She turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving a silence in her wake that neither Rocco nor Mara seemed able to immediately fill. "Is she right?" Mara asked eventually, quiet, unable to keep the question from surfacing. "About the people who love you, about how it ends for them." Rocco was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard from him before. "My mother died in a car accident that was never conclusively proven to be an accident," he said. "My grandmother died of grief, according to everyone who knew her, within 2 years of losing the man she loved to obligations he couldn't escape. My grandfather died barely weeks after finally finding you." His eyes met hers, dark and haunted. "I have spent my entire adult life believing that loving me is a death sentence I have no right to hand anyone. Gia isn't wrong to warn you. She's simply cruel about how she's chosen to do it." "And yet you told me you loved me anyway," Mara said softly, "knowing all of that." "Because the alternative," Rocco said, "was pretending I didn't, and watching you walk through the rest of your life without knowing you were loved as completely as I am capable of loving anyone. I decided, selfishly, that you deserved to know the truth, even if the truth comes with considerable risk attached." His hand found hers, gripping tightly. "I am trying, Mara, harder than I have tried at anything in my adult life, to make sure this does not become another name added to that particular grief. I need you to believe that I will not lose you the way I have lost everyone else." "I believe you're trying," Mara said. "I need that to be enough, for both of us." They left the club soon after, the night's calculated triumph curdled by Gia's cruelty into something more fragile, more urgent. A reminder, arriving precisely when they'd both begun to feel almost safe, that the war around them was far from finished, and that love, in their particular world, had always come with a body count attached. The weeks that followed brought a strange new normalcy to Mara's life. Strange because normalcy, in this context, meant learning to read threat assessments over breakfast, meant a rotating detail of armed men who nodded to her in the hallways like she was already family, meant falling asleep most nights in Rocco's arms, and waking to find him already awake, watching the door, watching her, as though sleep were a luxury he could no longer fully afford. She threw herself into learning the business, not out of ambition, but out of a growing conviction that ignorance was its own particular danger. Adler walked her through the legal architecture of the estate. A quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Teresa, who managed the family's legitimate holdings, taught her the difference between the shipping companies that were exactly what they appeared to be and the ones that existed to move things no customs form would ever accurately describe. "You're good at this," Teresa told her one afternoon, after Mara had caught a discrepancy in a set of accounts that 3 more experienced analysts had missed. Better than good. Salvatore had an instinct for numbers that hid intentions. You have it too. "I used to balance the till at a diner," Mara said. "This feels like it should be harder than it is." "Perhaps," Teresa said, studying her with new appraisal. "You were always meant for more than a diner." Perhaps Salvatore recognized that in the 6 weeks he had to look. It was around this time that the first real crack appeared, not from Moretti's camp, but from within Rocco's own ranks. She found Rocco in his study late one night, poring over ledgers with an expression she'd learned to recognize as trouble. "What's wrong?" "My father's old lieutenants are getting restless," he said, without looking up. "Men who served my father for 20 years before serving me. Some of them never fully accepted my authority. I took over young after his death, and there are those who believe a Conti empire led by a man in his early 30s, distracted by a woman with no criminal pedigree, is an empire ripe for exploitation." He finally met her eyes, and the exhaustion there worried her. "One of my own capos met with a Moretti intermediary last week. Nothing conclusive, a conversation, not yet a betrayal, but it tells me the foundation isn't as stable as I need it to be, with everything else happening at once." "What happens if it's not stable enough?" "Then I have a war on 2 fronts," Rocco said grimly. "External enemies trying to take what's mine, and internal ones deciding whether it's still worth defending. I've handled internal dissent before. It has never before coincided with the woman I love being an active target for assassination." He rubbed his eyes, and for a moment the mask of total control slipped, revealing something achingly human beneath it. A man stretched thinner than he wanted her to see. "Let me help," Mara said. "Mara, I mean it," she pressed. "You said I'm good at this. Let me actually be useful, instead of just being protected. If there are men questioning your judgment because of me, let me prove them wrong, instead of hiding from the question." Rocco studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Pride, fear, reluctant admiration all tangled together. "It would mean exposure," he said carefully. "A more public role. More visibility means more risk, not less." "I've already been shot at in a garden," Mara said, with a dark humour that surprised them both. "I don't think hiding has been keeping me particularly safe so far. Let me be visible on purpose instead of vulnerable by accident." The following week, Rocco called a meeting of his senior capos, men who had served the family for decades, whose loyalty had been quietly, corrosively called into question. Mara sat beside him, not at his side as an ornament, but as an active presence, reviewing figures Teresa had prepared, asking pointed questions about the shell company one lieutenant, a heavy-set man named Bruno, had been managing with what turned out to be increasingly creative accounting. "You've been skimming," Mara said, when the numbers had all been laid bare, her voice steady, despite the way every man in the room turned to stare at her with a mixture of shock and open hostility. 11% above documented losses over the last 6 months, funneled through a subsidiary registered to your brother-in-law. That's not caution in uncertain times. That's theft dressed up as prudence. Bruno's face went through several colours before settling on a dangerous, cornered red. "You take the word of a waitress over 30 years of loyal service?" "I'd take the word of the numbers," Mara said, unflinching, "which don't care how long you've served, only what you've actually done with what was entrusted to you." She looked to Rocco, who had remained silent throughout, watching with an unreadable intensity. "The choice of what happens next isn't mine to make, but the evidence is." The silence that followed stretched taut as wire. Then Rocco spoke, his voice carrying the particular quiet that Mara had learned meant absolute, immovable authority. "Bruno," he said, "you have until tomorrow morning to return every cent, with interest, to the accounts you stole from. After that, I no longer consider you family, and you will discover precisely how differently I treat men who are not." His eyes swept the rest of the room, and let it be understood by everyone present that the woman beside me is not an ornament and not a liability. She caught in one afternoon what 3 of you failed to notice in 6 months. Treat her loyalty and her judgment with the respect both have clearly earned. Bruno left the meeting a broken man. The rest left with a new, wary respect that Mara felt settle over her, like armour she hadn't known she needed. That night, back in the penthouse, Rocco pulled her against him with a fierce, wondering tenderness. "You terrified me today," he admitted into her hair. "Not because you were in danger, because I watched you become someone capable of running this empire beside me, and some old, foolish part of me mourned the simplicity of the waitress I first met, even while the rest of me fell impossibly further in love with the woman standing in that room." "I'm still her," Mara said. "The waitress. I just have better math now, and worse enemies." Rocco laughed, a real laugh, rare and unguarded, the sound of a man who had forgotten, until recently, that laughter was still available to him. "God help Moretti," he said, "when he finally understands exactly what he's actually up against." It was Teresa who first noticed the discrepancy that would unravel everything. A security log, 3 weeks old, showing an access badge used to enter the penthouse's private server room at an hour when, according to the official schedule, no one should have been present. "It's a service credential," Teresa told Rocco and Mara, spreading printouts across the study desk with visible unease. "Assigned to Rosa." Mara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's not possible. Rosa's been with this family for 15 years, Rocco finished grimly, "which is precisely why this needs to be handled carefully, and precisely why I suspect it's not what it appears to be at first glance." He studied the logs with narrowed eyes. "Rosa doesn't have server room clearance. She's never needed it. Someone either cloned her credentials or she's been compromised," Teresa finished quietly. They found Rosa in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner with the same unhurried competence she always brought to the task, and Mara felt sick with the strange, doubled grief of confronting someone she'd genuinely come to care for, with the possibility of profound betrayal. "Rosa," Rocco said, his voice gentle in a way that made clear he was hoping against evidence for an innocent explanation. I need to ask you about the server room. 3 weeks ago, at 11 in the evening, your credentials were used to access it. Rosa's hands stilled over the cutting board. When she turned, her face had gone pale, stripped of its usual warmth. I didn't go into the server room, she said. And something in her voice, fear, guilt, both, made Mara's stomach clench. But my grandson did. He's been in debt, Mr. Conti, gambling debts to men connected to the Morettis. They came to him, threatened his family, mine, my daughter, her children. They said if he didn't clone my badge and copy certain files, they would hurt them. I found out after it had already happened. I should have come to you immediately. I was afraid of what you'd do to him, afraid of what would happen to my family either way. The confession broke something open in the room. Rocco's expression cycling through fury, grief, and finally a weary sort of understanding that Mara found herself grateful for. "What files," he asked, quiet and controlled, "did they take?" "I don't know exactly," Rosa said, tears now falling freely. "Financial records, I think, property deeds, whatever was accessible from the main terminal that night." She looked between Rocco and Mara, anguish plain on her face. "I am so sorry. I have served this family 15 years. I would never have chosen this if there had been any other way to protect my daughter's children." "Where is your grandson now?" Rocco asked. "Hiding," Rosa said. "He ran after it was done, terrified of what you would do when you found out." Rocco was silent for a long moment, and Mara watched him wage some internal war between the ruthless calculus his position demanded and the compassion she'd come to know lived beneath it. "Bring him to me," he said finally. "Not for punishment, for protection. If Moretti's people are willing to threaten a grandmother's family to steal information, they will not hesitate to eliminate the boy once he's no longer useful to them. He's safer under my protection than running from both of us." His eyes met Rosa's, softening slightly. "You should have come to me the moment it happened, Rosa. 15 years should have taught you that I don't visit the sins of desperate men upon the families forced into desperation. But I understand why fear made the choice for you instead." Rosa wept. Gratitude and shame tangled together, and Mara felt her own throat tighten, watching a woman she'd come to consider something like a friend, revealed as an unwitting instrument of the very danger threatening them both. Later, alone with Rocco, the fuller weight of the betrayal settled over her. "What was in those files?" she asked. "What does he have now?" Rocco's expression when he answered had gone grim in a way that frightened her more than any gunfire had. "Property records," he said, "including the deed information for this penthouse and, cross-referenced against utility accounts, likely enough data to reconstruct our patterns of movement over the past month." He met her eyes. "He knows more about our daily rhythms now than I'm comfortable with any enemy possessing. This wasn't simple information theft, Mara. This was reconnaissance." "For what?" "I don't know yet," Rocco admitted, "but Moretti doesn't gather this kind of granular detail for an injunction hearing. This is the kind of information a man gathers before an operation he intends to make certain succeeds." His jaw tightened. "We need to move again. Somewhere entirely new, with no paper trail even Rosa's grandson could have reconstructed." That night, as they packed for another sudden relocation, Mara found herself gripped by a fear more insidious than the open violence of the farmhouse attack. The fear of an enemy who was no longer simply trying to break down the door, but had instead learned, patiently, silently, exactly where every door in the house was located, and precisely when it would be left unguarded. Somewhere across the city, in a study lined with old family portraits, Antonio Moretti reviewed the stolen files with a cold, satisfied smile, and picked up the phone to finalize plans for an operation he had been patiently constructing for weeks. One that would strike not at the penthouse, not at the farmhouse, but at the one place neither Rocco nor Mara had thought to fully guard: the fragile, fraying trust between Rocco and his own men. They relocated to a hotel Rocco owned through a labyrinth of holding companies even his closest lieutenants didn't fully understand. A boutique property in a quiet neighborhood, its top floor permanently reserved for exactly this kind of emergency. Its staff vetted so thoroughly that Rocco trusted them, he told Mara, more than he trusted some of his own blood relatives. It was there, 3 days later, that Bruno returned, the disgraced capo Mara had exposed weeks before, appearing at the hotel's private entrance with his hands raised, unarmed, and an expression of desperate contrition that immediately put every guard in the vicinity on high alert. "I need to speak with you," Bruno told Rocco once he'd been searched and cleared into a meeting room under heavy guard. "About Moretti. About what's actually coming." "You have 30 seconds, Rocco said, voice like a closing door, "before I decide this is simply another attempt at manipulation." "I made a mistake," Bruno said quickly. "The skimming, it was wrong. I know that now, and I've returned every cent as ordered. But in the process of trying to rebuild trust, I reached out to old contacts, trying to prove my loyalty by gathering information. And I found something you need to hear, regardless of what you decide to do with me afterward." "Speak." "Moretti isn't planning another direct assault," Bruno said. "Not on the woman, not on any property. He's planning to hit the wedding." Mara felt the room tilt. What wedding? Bruno looked between them, confused by their confusion. "Yours," he said. "The announcement went out to select family allies 2 days ago, that Rocco Conti intends to marry Mara Vance within the month, consolidating the inheritance permanently under joint Conti control. I assumed you'd authorized it." Rocco's face had gone very still, and Mara understood, watching him, that this was news to him as much as to her. "I made no such announcement," Rocco said, quiet and dangerous. "Which means someone fabricated it, either to draw Moretti into a trap of their own devising, or to draw him toward a target he wouldn't otherwise have anticipated," Teresa finished, having entered mid-conversation, her expression grim. "A wedding is a fixed date, a fixed location, a guaranteed gathering of everyone connected to this inheritance in one place. If someone wanted to hand Moretti the perfect opportunity for a decisive strike, disguised as a false announcement, he'd have every reason to believe. Then someone inside my own organization is setting a trap for us to walk into," Rocco finished, his voice gone cold with fury. "Using a wedding neither of us has discussed, let alone planned." The investigation that followed consumed the following week. A painstaking, paranoid audit of every communication, every access log, every capo and lieutenant with sufficient standing to fabricate such an announcement convincingly. It was Mara, poring over financial records with Teresa late one night, who found the thread that finally unravelled the conspiracy. "Adler," she said, staring at a wire transfer that had crossed her desk, disguised as a routine legal retainer payment. "Our lawyer. There's a payment here, 3 weeks ago, from a shell account that traces back. Teresa, look at this." To the same holding company that owns the security firm Moretti's people used to surveil the farmhouse. Teresa's face went pale. Adler drafted the will, she said slowly. He had access to every detail of the estate, every provision, every piece of information that mattered. If he's been compromised, then he's had a hand in shaping the legal battle from the very beginning, Rocco said, having entered the room at the tail end of the conversation, his expression thunderous. The injunction, the delays, all of it potentially orchestrated to buy Moretti exactly the time he needed to plan something larger than a simple assassination attempt. They confronted Adler the following morning in his own glass tower office, Rocco's fury barely leashed beneath a veneer of professional calm that fooled no one in the room. "I want to know," Rocco said, "why a payment from a Moretti-linked shell company appears in your firm's accounts 3 weeks before a fabricated wedding announcement conveniently designed to draw an assassination attempt." Adler's composure cracked visibly, sweat beading at his hairline despite the office's cool air conditioning. I didn't fabricate anything maliciously," he stammered. "Moretti's people approached me months ago, before Salvatore even died. They wanted advance notice of the will's contents, that's all, initially. I told myself it was harmless, information, not action. But once the will named Miss Vance, they demanded more. Access, delays, opportunities. I was afraid to refuse. You don't understand what these people are capable of." "I understand precisely what they're capable of," Rocco said, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "I have spent the last month burying men who died proving it. What I want to know now is who fabricated the wedding announcement and when, exactly, Moretti intends to act on it." Adler's hands shook as he finally, fully, broke. "The wedding was my suggestion," he admitted. "Moretti wanted a guaranteed opportunity, a fixed event where security would be complex, where his own people could infiltrate as staff or guests. I told him a wedding announcement would draw you both out, publicly, in a way that made an ambush plausible without seeming premeditated. He's planning to strike 2 weeks from now, at a venue his people are already scouting, using a guest list I helped construct to include several of his own operatives disguised as extended Conti family." The room went very quiet, the full scope of the conspiracy finally laid bare. 2 weeks, Rocco said finally, his voice gone flat with the particular calm that Mara now understood preceded his most dangerous decisions. "Then we have 2 weeks to decide exactly how this trap is going to close, and on whom." He looked at Mara, something fierce and resolute settling into his expression. And she understood, watching him, that whatever came next would not be a matter of hiding or fleeing any longer. It would be a reckoning, finally, on Rocco's own terms. "We're going to give Moretti his wedding," Rocco said, "just not the one he's expecting." The plan, when Rocco finally laid it out for her, was audacious enough to make Mara's breath catch. "We hold the wedding," he said, spreading a floor plan of the venue across the study table. An old, elegant ballroom in the heart of the city, chosen specifically for its multiple entrances and sightlines, its history as neutral ground respected, however fragilely, by every family with roots deep enough to remember why. Publicly, on the date Adler already leaked, we let Moretti believe his opportunity is exactly as advertised. And then, Rocco said, we make certain that every advantage he believes he holds is in fact an advantage we've engineered him into believing he has. His infiltrators, identified through Adler's guest list, will be allowed into the venue, watched, contained, unable to move without triggering a response they won't survive. His extraction routes will be quietly compromised in advance, and Moretti himself, who will not be able to resist attending in some capacity to oversee an operation this significant, will walk into a room he believes he controls and discover, too late, that he has walked into the single most heavily fortified trap of his entire career. "You're using our wedding as bait." "I'm using the idea of our wedding as bait," Rocco corrected gently. "Which is, I'll admit, considerably easier to arrange than an actual wedding on 2 weeks' notice, though I find myself somewhat disappointed by that fact, given the alternative." His eyes met hers, and something serious moved beneath the tactical calculation. "Though I want you to know, when I do ask you to marry me, and I fully intend to, someday, I would like it to be an actual proposal, born of choice rather than strategic necessity. You deserve considerably more romance than a trap laid for Antonio Moretti." Despite everything, Mara felt herself laugh, a real laugh, startled out of her by the absurd tenderness buried inside such a lethal plan. "Noted," she said. "I'll hold you to that, assuming we both survive whatever happens in 2 weeks." The preparations that followed were unlike anything Mara could have imagined. A wedding built entirely as theatre, every detail calculated for maximum tactical advantage, disguised as maximum romantic spectacle. She found herself, despite the circumstances, unexpectedly moved by the process. Choosing a dress that Teresa insisted needed to look convincingly bridal, even though its true purpose was concealing a discreet layer of body armour beneath the silk. Walking through the venue with Rocco's security chief, memorizing exits disguised as memorizing a processional route. Learning, in painstaking detail, exactly where every one of Moretti's suspected operatives would be seated, and exactly how quickly they could be neutralized if the operation went sideways. "Does it feel strange?" she asked Rocco the night before, "planning our fake wedding with more care than most people plan their real ones?" "Everything about us has been strange from the beginning," Rocco said, pulling her close in the quiet dark of their hotel suite. "I met you as the granddaughter of the only man I've ever fully respected, discovered I loved you within days of nearly losing you to gunfire, and now I'm orchestrating an ambush disguised as our wedding to finally end a war that predates both of us by decades." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I would not change a single moment of it, strange as all of it has been, not even the parts that terrified me. Not even the gunfire." "Especially not the gunfire," he said with dark humour. "It's how I learned exactly how much I had to lose." The day of the wedding arrived cloaked in a beauty that felt almost cruel, given what it concealed. A perfect summer afternoon, golden light spilling through the ballroom's tall windows, string quartet playing something achingly lovely, while beneath the surface of every polite smile and raised champagne glass, Rocco's security detail tracked the movements of 17 confirmed Moretti operatives with the patient, coiled readiness of men who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of violence. Mara walked down an aisle built entirely as a trap, in a dress designed to hide armour beneath its beauty, toward a man she genuinely loved, in a ceremony designed to end in bloodshed rather than vows, and felt the strange vertigo of true emotion and calculated deception existing simultaneously in the same breath. Rocco waited for her at the altar, and despite everything, despite the armed men disguised as caterers, despite the exits marked in his mind like a battlefield map, despite the fact that neither of them expected this ceremony to conclude with an actual marriage, his eyes, when they found hers, held something unguarded and true. "You look extraordinary," he murmured as she reached him, his hand finding hers with a grip that communicated far more than the words allowed. "Whatever happens in the next hour, I need you to know that this moment, you walking toward me, is real, regardless of everything surrounding it." "I know," Mara whispered back. "I chose to walk toward you. That part isn't a trap for anyone." The officiant, a man whose actual ordination was, Mara suspected, considerably more legitimate than either of them had bothered to verify, given the ceremony's true purpose, began the vows in a voice that carried through the golden afternoon light, and somewhere in the crowd 17 armed men waited for a signal that would never come the way they expected, while somewhere beyond the ballroom's elegant walls, Antonio Moretti settled into a car with a clear line of sight to the venue, and gave the order he believed would finally end this war in his family's favour. He would discover, within the hour, exactly how badly he had underestimated the man he'd spent 30 years trying to destroy. The first sign of trouble came not from Moretti's operatives inside the ballroom, but from a discreet earpiece transmission that reached Rocco's security chief precisely as the officiant reached the exchange of rings. A fabricated formality neither Rocco nor Mara had expected to need, since the plan called for the operation to conclude before vows were ever completed. "Movement outside the east entrance," the transmission crackled. "3 vehicles, unmarked, Moretti's personal car among them." Rocco's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around Mara's. The only outward sign of the shift from ceremony to combat readiness that had just occurred beneath his composed exterior. "It's time," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Whatever happens next, stay close to me and trust the plan." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left Mara's memory of it fractured into disconnected, vivid fragments. The officiant, revealed as one of Rocco's own men in disguise, producing a concealed weapon the instant the first gunshot rang out from the ballroom's rear entrance. The 17 suspected Moretti operatives, seated among the wedding guests, rising in near unison, only to find themselves already surrounded by Conti security, who had been tracking their every movement for the entire ceremony. The controlled, brutal efficiency with which men who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this moment neutralized a threat that had believed itself, until the very last second, to hold every advantage. Mara found herself pulled behind an overturned banquet table by Rocco himself, his body once again covering hers with the same fierce, instinctive protection she'd experienced in the farmhouse garden weeks before, his gun already drawn, his eyes tracking the chaos unfolding around them with lethal precision. "Stay down," he told her, echoing words that had become, in the space of a single terrifying month, a kind of vow between them. "This ends today, one way or another." Through the gaps in the overturned table, Mara watched Antonio Moretti himself stride into the ballroom, flanked by bodyguards, his expression carrying the particular fury of a man who had just realized, too late, that the trap he'd walked into had been laid specifically for him. "Rocco Conti!" Moretti's voice carried across the chaos, cold and commanding despite the collapse of his operation around him. You would use your own wedding as a killing floor. Even for you, that's a particular kind of ruthlessness. I learned from the best, Antonio. Rocco rose from behind the table, weapon steady, his voice carrying the flat, lethal calm Mara had come to recognize as his most dangerous register. You sent men to kill the woman I love in a garden. You had my staff coerced into betraying us through threats against their families. You fabricated a wedding I never announced, specifically to lure us both into an ambush. His eyes were cold as winter stone. Did you truly believe I would walk into that trap unprepared, simply because grief has made me sentimental? My grandfather taught me better than that, even in death. Your grandfather, Moretti spat, was a sentimental fool who threw away an empire on a waitress out of misplaced guilt for a woman he should have let die in obscurity 40 years ago. I have simply been trying to correct his final, catastrophic error. By murdering an innocent woman for money, Mara said, rising from behind the table, despite Rocco's hand trying to hold her back, unable to stay silent any longer, adrenaline and fury overriding fear. That's not correcting an error, Antonio. That's exactly the kind of greed my grandfather spent his whole life trying to escape. Moretti's eyes found her, cold and assessing. Ah, the waitress speaks. Tell me, does it comfort you at all, standing there in your wedding dress, to know that whatever happens today, you will always be the woman who inherited a fortune she never earned, at the cost of every life lost fighting over it? What comforts me, Mara said, standing straighter despite every instinct urging her to stay hidden, is knowing that, unlike you, I never asked for a single cent of it. I would have been perfectly happy serving coffee for the rest of my life. You're the one who decided innocent people needed to die over money that was never yours to begin with. A tense silence followed, broken only by the ragged breathing of contained hostages and the quiet professional movements of Conti security securing the last of Moretti's neutralized operatives. You're surrounded, Antonio, Rocco said finally, his voice quiet now, almost gentle, in the way of a man delivering a verdict rather than a threat. Every man you brought is disarmed or dead. Your extraction routes were compromised before you ever arrived. You have exactly one choice remaining, and it isn't the choice to escape. Moretti's composure finally cracked, decades of carefully maintained authority crumbling into something closer to desperation. This isn't over, he said, though the words carried the hollow ring of a man who understood, even as he said them, that they very likely were. Families like ours don't simply surrender because one battle is lost. No, Rocco agreed. But they do surrender when the alternative is annihilation, and I promise you, Antonio, annihilation is precisely what continues if you walk out of this room still believing there's a version of this war you can still win.
He gestured, and two of his men moved to flank Moretti, weapons lowered but present, an offer of surrender dressed in the language of inevitability.
Give the order to your remaining people to stand down, permanently, and I will allow you to leave this room alive, to negotiate whatever terms of peace your pride can still tolerate. Refuse, and I promise you will not leave it at all.
The silence stretched, taut and terrible, while Antonio Moretti, a man who had spent 30 years believing himself untouchable, finally understood. standing in the wreckage of his own carefully laid trap.
Exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered by a man he had once dismissed as too young, too sentimental, too distracted by love to be truly dangerous. He had been wrong on every count, and the cost of that misjudgment was about to reshape the balance of power in a war that had raged in one form or another for 3 generations. Antonio Moretti surrendered in the end, not because he wanted peace, but because the arithmetic of the moment left him no alternative. 17 operatives neutralized, extraction routes compromised, his own life balanced on the knife's edge of Rocco's mercy. He gave the order through gritted teeth and watched his remaining people lower their weapons with the particular humiliation of a man who had spent decades cultivating an image of invincibility, now shattered publicly before witnesses who would carry the story back to every family capable of exploiting his weakened position. The negotiations that followed took place not in the ruined ballroom, but in a private room adjoining it. Rocco and Moretti seated across from each other with the particular formal coldness of men who understood that whatever words passed between them now would determine the shape of an entire criminal ecosystem for years to come. "You will cede all claims to the Conti estate," Rocco said, laying out terms with the flat precision of a man who had clearly anticipated this exact negotiation for weeks. "Permanently, in writing, notarized before witnesses from 3 other families, to ensure the agreement holds weight beyond your own word. You will withdraw the injunction. You will pay reparations to the families of the men killed in the farmhouse attack, an amount to be determined by an independent arbiter. And you will never again, directly or through intermediary, threaten the life of Mara Vance or any person under Conti protection for as long as either of us lives." And in exchange, Moretti's voice carried the bitterness of a defeated man negotiating from a position he clearly despised. "In exchange," Rocco said, "you keep your life, your remaining territories, and whatever dignity you can salvage from today's events. I have no interest in destroying your entire family, Antonio, whatever satisfaction that might bring me personally. I have interest only in ending a war that never needed to happen, and ensuring it does not resume." Moretti was silent for a long moment, studying Rocco with an expression that mixed grudging respect with lingering resentment. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said finally, though the words carried a complicated weight. "Ruthless enough to win, merciful enough to avoid the kind of vendetta that consumes entire generations. It's a difficult balance. Few men manage it. I learned from watching what happens when that balance fails," Rocco said. "Your family and mine have bled each other for 3 generations over grievances neither of us fully remembers the origin of anymore. I would prefer my children, should I be fortunate enough to have any, inherit something other than an inevitable war." Something flickered across Moretti's face, surprise, perhaps, at the mention of a future Rocco clearly intended to build, with the woman waiting anxiously in the next room. "You're serious about her, then?" "Not simply a strategic marriage to consolidate the inheritance." "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," Rocco said, without hesitation. "Which is, I suspect, precisely why your daughter's warning to her at the club troubled you enough to accelerate your timeline. You understood that a Rocco Conti genuinely in love was considerably more dangerous and considerably more motivated than a Rocco Conti simply protecting an asset." Moretti's silence confirmed the observation without either man needing to state it further. The formal agreement was signed within the hour, witnessed by representatives from two neutral families whose presence ensured the terms would be respected industry-wide, and Antonio Moretti left the ruined ballroom a diminished man. Not destroyed, as he might once have feared, but stripped of the leverage and ambition that had driven 30 years of conflict, forced now to rebuild whatever remained of his family's standing without the inheritance he had spent decades believing was rightfully his. Mara found Rocco afterward in the now quiet ballroom, wedding decorations still standing amid the aftermath of violence. The surreal juxtaposition of romance and warfare finally settling into something like an ending. "Is it over?" she asked. "The war, yes," Rocco said, pulling her into his arms with an exhaustion that spoke to weeks of accumulated tension finally releasing. "Moretti has ceded his claims. The injunction will be withdrawn by tomorrow. You are, as of this afternoon, the uncontested and fully secured heir to everything my grandfather built." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "You are safe, Mara. Truly, finally safe, for the first time since that man in the suit knocked on your apartment door." Mara felt something in her chest finally unclench, weeks of accumulated fear releasing into an exhaustion so complete it nearly buckled her knees. "I don't know how to process that," she admitted. "Being safe. It feels like a language I've forgotten how to speak." "Then we'll learn it together," Rocco said, slowly if necessary. "There's no more urgency now, no more countdown to the next attack. Just us, and whatever we choose to build from what's left standing." He pulled back to look at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression that she'd rarely seen from him even in their most private moments. "Speaking of which, I believe I made you a promise about a proposal born of choice rather than strategic necessity." Mara's breath caught. "Rocco, not today," he said gently before she could finish the thought. "Today was theatre, however genuine the vows might have felt in the moment. When I ask you properly, it will be somewhere far from ballrooms and ambushes, somewhere that belongs only to us, with no audience but the two of us, and whatever future we've decided to build." His thumb traced her cheek with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "But I wanted you to know, now, while the danger is finally behind us, that the promise still stands. I intend to marry you, Mara Vance, properly, some day soon, when you're ready, and when the asking is only ever about love, and never again about strategy." Outside the ballroom's tall windows, the golden summer afternoon continued, undisturbed by the violence that had unfolded within. Indifferent, as cities always are, to the private wars fought and won beneath their skylines, and Mara allowed herself, finally, to believe that the worst of it truly was behind them. She would be wrong, though not in the way either of them expected. The next threat to their fragile peace would come not from without, but from within the very inheritance that had brought them together in the first place. 3 weeks of genuine peace followed the confrontation at the ballroom, the first extended stretch of calm Mara had known since the black car had first parked outside her laundromat apartment. And she found herself, in that quiet, finally able to grieve properly for the life she'd lost, and to begin imagining the shape of the one that had replaced it. It was during this peace that Teresa approached her with a discovery that would complicate everything they believed they understood about Salvatore's final months. "There's an account," Teresa said, spreading documents across Mara's desk in the study that had, over the preceding weeks, become genuinely hers rather than simply borrowed space. Offshore, established 6 months before Salvatore's death, funded with a transfer of nearly $80 million from the main estate. It's not mentioned anywhere in the will. Mara frowned, studying the transaction records. Who has access to it? That's what's strange, Teresa said. The account requires biometric verification tied to a single individual, and the biometric profile on file isn't Salvatore's. It's yours. The room seemed to still around Mara as the implication settled. Mine? But I didn't even know this account existed until 30 seconds ago. Salvatore must have arranged it before his death, Teresa said. Somehow obtained the biometric data needed to set the access parameters, likely through the investigators who'd been tracking Elena's family for years, if they'd gathered any of your medical or employment records along the way. It's an extraordinary thing to have arranged, honestly. Most people wouldn't think to establish a secured account for an heir who didn't yet know she was an heir. They brought Rocco into the discovery that evening, and his reaction, a mixture of fascination and unease, told Mara this was as surprising to him as it was to her. $80 million, he said, studying the transfer records with narrowed eyes, separate from the main estate, accessible only to you, established months before he even approached you at the diner. He looked up at her. This wasn't an oversight in the will, Mara. This was deliberate. My grandfather built you an escape hatch, money entirely separate from the inheritance war, that no court challenge or family dispute could ever touch, because legally it was never part of the estate to begin with. An escape hatch from what? From exactly what happened, Rocco said slowly, understanding dawning across his face. From the war he must have known his will would trigger the moment he decided to leave everything to a stranger. He anticipated the Moretti challenge. He anticipated the danger. And he built you a way out. Money enough to disappear entirely. Start a new life somewhere untouchable. If the cost of the inheritance ever became too high for you to bear. Mara sat with that revelation for a long moment, tears rising unexpectedly as the full weight of Salvatore's foresight and love settled over her. He was protecting me, she said quietly, even from the protection he was giving me. He knew the money might get me killed, and he made sure I'd have a way to walk away from all of it if I ever needed to. He loved you the way he should have been allowed to love your mother, Rocco said gently, completely, and with the wisdom to know that love sometimes means building an exit, even while you're also building a fortress. There was a note attached to the account, they discovered, a letter written in Salvatore's careful hand, dated the week before his death, held in escrow to be released only upon the account's activation. My dearest Mara, the letter began, and Mara's hands trembled as she read it aloud, Rocco's arms steady around her shoulders. If you are reading this, it means the burden of what I have left you has grown heavier than any young woman should have to carry, and you have found your way at last to this quiet corner of my estate that no one else can touch. I want you to know that everything else, the empire, the fortune, the wars it will surely provoke, was never truly the gift I intended for you. This was the freedom to walk away, fully and completely, should the cost of staying ever exceed what any inheritance is worth. I spent 40 years searching for your mother, wishing only that I could have given her the choice to live a life untouched by by the violence of my world. I could not give that gift to her. I give it, instead, to you. Take this money, and if you ever need to, disappear from all of it. The family, the danger even, should it come to this, the grandson I hope with all my heart you have come to love as much as I suspect he already loves you. You owe none of us your suffering. You have already given more than enough, simply by allowing an old man his gelato and his questions, in the last weeks of a life that had, until you, forgotten what tenderness felt like. Whatever you choose, know that you were loved, completely and without condition, by the grandfather you never knew you had. Salvatore. Mara wept then, fully, the accumulated grief of losing a grandfather she'd barely had time to know, finally breaking free. And Rocco held her through it, without a single word, understanding, perhaps better than anyone alive, exactly what it meant to grieve a man who had loved so fiercely and so imperfectly across an entire lifetime. "He gave me a way out," Mara said finally, when the tears had slowed. "Even from you, even from all of this." "He did," Rocco agreed, quiet and unflinching. "And I want you to know, Mara, that the offer stands, regardless of anything I might feel about it personally. If this life, the danger, the responsibility, even me, ever becomes more than you're willing to carry, that money is yours, free of any obligation to stay. I will not be the reason you feel trapped in an inheritance you never asked for." Mara looked up at him, at the raw vulnerability in his expression, and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what she wanted to say. "I know I have a way out," she said. "I've always had a way out, since that first night in the stairwell when you offered me your hand. I keep choosing to stay anyway, Rocco. Not because of the money, and not because I feel trapped by any of it. I stay because somewhere between the gelato and the gunfire and the fake wedding that felt more real than anything in my old life ever did, I fell in love with a man who has spent this entire ordeal choosing my safety over his own, again and again, without ever once asking anything in return." Rocco's composure, so carefully maintained through weeks of violence and negotiation, finally broke, something raw and grateful moving across his face as he pulled her against him. "Then stay," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Not because you have to, because I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my entire life. And I would like very much the chance to prove that to you for as many years as we're both fortunate enough to be given." Rocco kept his promise 3 weeks later, on a night neither of them would ever forget. He took her to Sicily, to the coastal town where Salvatore had been born, where the empire that had reshaped both their lives had first taken root in a fisherman's son too proud to let his family drown in debt. They walked the old harbour at sunset, past docks Salvatore had once controlled from an ocean away, the Mediterranean turning gold and rose beneath a sky that seemed, Mara thought, entirely too beautiful for the weight of everything that had happened to bring them there. "This is where he grew up," Rocco told her, as they walked hand in hand along a stone quay worn smooth by centuries of fishermen's boots. "Where he learned to survive, and later where he learned to build something no one could ever take from him by force. I thought you should see it, where all of this truly began, long before either of us existed to inherit its consequences." "It's beautiful," Mara said, watching the fishing boats bob gently in the harbour, their colours bright against the darkening water. "I wish he could have shown me himself." In a way, Rocco said, I think he did. Every choice he made, every piece of this journey, however painful, led us here, together, in the place where his story began. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and Mara felt her heart still at the expression on his face. None of the careful control she'd grown so used to, only naked, unguarded emotion. Mara, he said, his voice rough with feeling. I have spent my entire life believing that love was a vulnerability I could not afford, a door left open for enemies to walk through, a weakness that had cost my family everything it had ever loved. I built walls so thoroughly around myself that I nearly forgot love was something other than a liability to be managed. He reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box that made Mara's breath catch entirely. And then a waitress bought an old man gelato with her own tip money. And everything I believed about love and safety and control began, slowly and then completely, to unravel. He knelt, there on the ancient stones of Salvatore's home harbour, the ring inside the box catching the last golden light of sunset, not ostentatious, Mara noted through tears already rising, but achingly beautiful, an antique setting that Rocco explained, voice thick with emotion, had belonged to his grandmother, the woman Salvatore had loved so completely he'd never removed her photograph from any house he'd owned. I am not a gentle man, Rocco said, and I will not pretend the life I'm asking you to share will ever be entirely free of danger or difficulty. But I promise you, Mara Vance, that I will spend every remaining day I am given loving you as completely, as fiercely, and as unconditionally as my grandfather loved the family he lost and the granddaughter he found too late to properly know. Marry me. Not for the inheritance, not for safety, not for any strategic necessity, simply because I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this life, and I cannot imagine building whatever comes next without you beside me. Mara sank to her knees in the stone dust of the harbour, taking his face in both hands, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Yes, she said, before he'd even fully finished the question, laughter and tears tangling together in her voice. Yes, Rocco, 1,000 times yes. I fell in love with you somewhere between a stairwell and a garden full of gunfire, and I have never once regretted a single terrifying, impossible moment of it. He kissed her then, there on the harbour, where an empire and a love story had both, in their own ways, begun, the last light of sunset gilding the water around them, and for the first time since a black car had parked outside a laundromat and changed everything, Mara Vance felt, completely and without reservation, that she had found exactly where she belonged. They were married 3 months later, in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to the calculated theatre of the ballroom trap. A small, private gathering at the Sicilian farmhouse that had once been Salvatore's retreat, attended only by those who had proven, through blood and loyalty both, that they belonged in the circle of trust Rocco and Mara had built together. Teresa stood as witness. Rosa, forgiven and reinstated after her grandson had been quietly relocated to safety under Conti protection, wept through the entire ceremony. Even Adler, stripped of his position but spared harsher consequences in recognition of the coercion that had driven his betrayal, sent a card that Mara, with a generosity she suspected would have made Salvatore proud, chose to accept in the spirit it was intended. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Mara whispered to Rocco, as they danced beneath string lights strung between old olive trees, the same farmhouse where guards had once died protecting her, transformed now into a place of celebration rather than siege. "He would have loved you," Rocco corrected gently, "exactly as much as I do." Perhaps that's the truest inheritance he left either of us, not the money, not the empire, but proof that even in a life built on violence and control, it's still possible to love completely and to be loved in return, without condition or calculation. Somewhere in the farmhouse library, Salvatore's journals sat carefully preserved, his final entries, written in the 6 weeks he'd known Mara, without her ever understanding who he truly was, now understood in their full, aching context. A love letter from a grandfather to a granddaughter he'd found too late and loved completely anyway. The war was over, the empire secured, and in a farmhouse garden where blood had once been spilled defending a stranger who had somehow, impossibly, become the centre of an entire dangerous world, two people who had never expected to find love in the wreckage of an inheritance war danced instead beneath the stars, finally, fully, safely home. A year passed, and then another, and the empire Salvatore Conti had built across a lifetime of ruthless ambition slowly, deliberately, began to transform under the joint stewardship of his granddaughter and the grandson he'd raised to inherit it. Mara never fully abandoned the instincts of the waitress she'd once been, the woman who'd noticed a lonely old man's sadness and bought him gelato from her own tip money without expecting anything in return. She brought that same instinct to the empire itself, gradually shifting resources, influence, and infrastructure away from the violence that had defined 3 generations of Conti power toward legitimate holdings that Salvatore had always maintained but rarely prioritized. Shipping routes that moved only cargo rather than contraband. Banks that financed small businesses rather than laundering blood money. A foundation established in Elena's name that funded scholarships for young women who'd grown up, as Mara once had, without any knowledge of the fortunes and legacies hidden in their own blood. "You're changing everything he built," Rocco observed one evening, watching her review foundation grant applications with the same careful attention she'd once brought to balancing a diner's till. "I'm honouring what he actually wanted," Mara corrected gently. "He spent his whole life building an empire through violence, and his final act was trying to give someone he loved a way to escape that same violence entirely. I think the truest way to honour that is to make sure fewer people ever need an escape hatch like the one he built for me." Rocco considered that for a long moment, something like wonder moving across his face, the particular wonder, Mara had come to recognise, of a man discovering that the woman he loved continued to surprise him, even years into a marriage built on more honesty and partnership than either of them had believed themselves capable of before meeting each other. "He would be proud," Rocco said finally. "I think, in his own complicated way, this was always what he hoped for. Not simply that his fortune would survive him, but that it might finally become something worth surviving for." Antonio Moretti, true to the terms negotiated in the wreckage of that fateful wedding, never again threatened Conti Holdings all Mara's safety, though the peace between their families remained in the way of all such peace among men who had spent generations at war. A fragile thing, maintained through careful diplomacy rather than genuine reconciliation. Gia Moretti, surprisingly, became something like a distant ally in the years that followed, her early cruelty toward Mara softening into a wary respect once she'd witnessed firsthand exactly how thoroughly Mara had proven herself capable of surviving and thriving within a world that had never expected a waitress to hold her ground against it. Rosa remained with the family, her loyalty, once tested by desperate circumstance, proving unshakable in the years that followed. Her grandson, given a genuine second chance under Conti protection, eventually found honest work managing logistics for one of the family's legitimate shipping operations, a small act of mercy that rippled outward into a lifetime of quiet gratitude. And in the farmhouse library, where Salvatore's journals remained carefully preserved, Mara added her own volumes to the collection over the years, records not of violence or business, but of a life reconstructed from unexpected inheritance into something genuinely worth living. The birth of a daughter they named Elena, in honor of the mother and grandmother whose lost story had brought them together. The slow, patient work of transforming an empire built on fear into something closer to a legacy built on protection. The ordinary, precious moments of a marriage that had begun in gunfire and threat and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become something genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. "Do you ever miss it?" Rocco asked her once, years into their marriage, as they watched their daughter chase fireflies across the same garden where guards had once died protecting her mother. "The old life, the diner, before any of this happened to you." Mara considered the question seriously, watching Elena's small silhouette dart through the deepening twilight, golden and carefree, in a way that made Mara's chest ache with gratitude for every dangerous, impossible choice that had led them here. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I miss the simplicity of it, worrying about rent instead of assassination attempts, arguing with Frank about schedule changes instead of negotiating peace treaties with mafia dons." She turned to look at Rocco, love and certainty settling over her features. "But I wouldn't trade any of it. Not really. Not the danger, not the grief, not even the fear. Because all of it led me here, to you, to her, to a life I never could have imagined for myself, standing behind that diner counter, refilling coffee for a lonely old man who turned out to be the grandfather I never knew I had." Rocco pulled her close, resting his chin against her hair as they watched their daughter's laughter carry across the garden into the gathering dark. "He gave you everything," he said quietly, without ever intending the true gift to be the money at all. "No," Mara agreed, turning in his arms to press a kiss against his jaw. "The true gift was always you. Everything else, the fortune, the danger, the war we survived together, that was simply the price of admission to a life I would choose again every single time, regardless of the cost." Above them, the Sicilian stars wheeled slowly into full darkness, ancient and indifferent to the small, fierce human dramas that had played out beneath them for generations. The fisherman's son, who had built an empire from nothing. The daughter he'd lost and searched for across 40 years of quiet grief. The granddaughter, who had inherited not just a fortune, but a legacy of love, complicated enough to nearly destroy her, and strong enough in the end to save her instead. Mara Vance. Mara Conti now, though she still sometimes signed her old name from habit, a small tether to the woman she'd been before an old man's kindness had rewritten the entire shape of her existence, stood in a garden that had once run red with violence, holding the hand of a man who had once told her love was a vulnerability he couldn't afford, and understood, with the particular clarity that only hard-won happiness provides, that some inheritances were worth every danger required to claim them. The empire endured. The peace, however fragile, held. And somewhere beyond the garden's edge, in a library full of old journals and older grief, the story of a waitress who had inherited a mafia fortune, finally, completely, became instead the story of a woman who had built, from the wreckage of that inheritance, something far more valuable than money had ever promised her. A family, a purpose, and a love that had survived exactly the kind of danger it was born from.